Welcome to the Oracle's Rest, a place where stories unfold slowly, where time softens, and where the mind is free to wander. Tonight, we return to the banks of the Nile, to a world shaped by rhythm, by stone, and by belief. Long before names like Tutankhamun and Ramses were remembered, before monuments rose high enough to touch the horizon, the idea of the pharaoh had not yet fully taken form. There was no single ruler who stood above all others, no unified crown, no enduring image of a king who was also a god. Instead, there were communities scattered along the river, each one shaped by the rising and falling of the Nile, each one adapting to a world that demanded patience and cooperation. The river gave life, but it also required understanding. Floods would come and recede, leaving behind fertile soil, but only if the land was prepared, only if people worked together, only if someone, somewhere, could organize the effort. And slowly, over time, the need for structure began to take shape, not all at once, not with a single moment of change, but gradually, as small leaders became larger ones, and influence extended beyond a single village, then beyond a region, and eventually toward something greater, what would later be known as Upper and Lower Egypt, were once separate lands, distinct in their identities, their symbols, their rulers, and yet the river connected them. Trade moved along its waters. Ideas traveled with it, and so did conflict. There came a time when division could no longer be sustained, when competing powers could not remain separate indefinitely. And from that tension, from that quiet pressure building across generations, emerged one of the most important turning points in ancient history. A ruler, remembered now as Nama, would bring these lands together, not just through force, but through symbolism, through the merging of identities, through the creation of something entirely new. A single crown formed from two, a single land formed from many. And with that, something changed. The ruler was no longer just a leader of people, but a figure who stood between worlds, between the land and the sky, between the people and the divine, between order and chaos. This was the beginning of the pharaoh. Over time, this role would grow, becoming more than authority, more than governance. It would become belief, a system in which the pharaoh was not only obeyed, but trusted to maintain the balance of the universe itself, to ensure that the Nile would rise, that the seasons would return, that life would continue as it always had. Centuries later, names like Ramses would come to represent power at its peak, and Tutankhamun, though young and largely unknown in life, would become one of the most recognized figures in the world, not because of what he ruled, but because of what remained. But all of that would come much later. To understand them, to understand the monuments, the temples, the vast and enduring legacy of ancient Egypt, we must begin here, at the moment when leadership became something more, when power became sacred, and when a ruler became a pharaoh. Take a slow breath and let the world of ancient Egypt unfold, one step at a time. The Nile did not simply give life, it required understanding. Each year, the river would rise, spreading outward across the land, covering fields that had once been dry, and leaving behind a dark, fertile soil. This cycle, predictable, yet never entirely certain, became the foundation of everything that followed, because while the flood brought abundance, it also demanded preparation. Fields had to be measured, boundaries redrawn, water redirected, and crops planted at the right moment, before the soil hardened again beneath the sun. And this was not something one person could do alone. In the earliest settlements, people lived close to the river's edge, in small communities, connected by necessity more than by design. Families worked together, then groups of families, and eventually entire villages began to coordinate their efforts. Simple systems emerged, markers placed in the soil to track land boundaries, tools shared across households, knowledge passed from one season to the next. But even in these early stages, a pattern was forming, because some individuals, by skill, by experience, or simply by circumstance, began to take on a different role. They observed the river more closely, remembered the timing of past floods, helped organize planting, settled disputes when land was divided unevenly, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, they became leaders. At first, this leadership was practical. It was not about power, but about coordination. Someone needed to decide when to plant, when to harvest, how to distribute water, and how to resolve conflict when resources were strained. Because the Nile, for all its generosity, could also be unpredictable. Some years, the flood would come too low, and the soil would dry before crops could take root. Other years, it would rise too high, washing away homes, tools, and carefully prepared land. And in those moments, uncertainty spread quickly. Food became scarce, tensions rose, and communities looked for stability. They looked for someone who could restore order. Over time, the role of the leader began to shift. No longer just a coordinator of labor, but a figure who carried responsibility for survival itself. Because if the flood failed, or if the harvest was poor, it was no longer seen as random. There was a growing sense that order in the world was something that could be maintained or lost, and that someone had to be responsible for that balance. This idea, subtle at first, would become one of the most important forces in Egyptian thought. The belief that the world existed in a state of balance, a delicate alignment between forces, between chaos and stability, between disorder and harmony, what would later be called Ma'at. But in these early moments, before the word itself was fully formed, the concept already existed. People could feel it in the rhythm of the river, in the success or failure of a harvest, in the quiet understanding that everything was connected. And if something disrupted that balance, it was not simply an accident. It meant something had gone wrong. So leadership became more than organization. It became responsibility for order itself. A leader was no longer just someone who guided people, but someone who stood at the center of this balance, someone who ensured that the land remained fertile, that disputes did not fracture the community, that the cycle of life continued without interruption. As generations passed, these leaders began to extend their influence. Villages became regions. Regions began to interact, sometimes through trade and sometimes through conflict, because the Nile did not separate people, it connected them, and along its length, different groups began to develop their own identities, their own symbols, their own ways of understanding the world. In the north, where the river spread into the delta, the land was wide and open, interwoven with channels of water. In the south, the Nile ran narrower, bounded by desert, more contained, more controlled. These differences shaped the people who lived there, and over time, they came to be seen not just as regions, but as distinct lands, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, each with its own rulers, each with its own traditions, each with its own sense of order, and yet they were never truly separate, because the river continued to bind them together, carrying goods, ideas, and influence from one to the other. As these regions grew, so did the scale of leadership. What had once been local authority began to stretch across larger areas. Leaders now governed not just villages, but networks of communities. They managed resources across distances, organized labor on a larger scale, and began to establish something more structured, more enduring. With this expansion came a new need, not just for leadership, but for systems, ways to track land, to record harvests, to organize labor beyond what could be remembered. And so, the earliest forms of administration began to emerge. Scribes, records, symbols carved into surfaces, marking ownership, measuring production, preserving decisions. These were not yet the monumental hieroglyphs that would later cover temple walls, but they were the beginning of something critical, the ability to record, to preserve knowledge, to extend authority beyond a single moment. And as this structure grew, so too did the perception of the leader. No longer just a person known within a community, but a figure whose influence could be felt across distances, a presence that existed not only in person, but through symbols, through decisions, through the systems that governed daily life. It was here, in this gradual expansion, that leadership began to take on a new dimension, not just practical, but symbolic, not just human, but something more. Because when a single figure becomes responsible for the order of many, when the success of entire regions depends on their decisions, when the rhythm of life itself seems tied to their presence, it becomes difficult to see them as ordinary. And so, slowly, the idea began to form that the leader was not only guiding the people, but was somehow connected to the forces that guided the world itself. This transformation did not happen all at once. There was no single moment when a leader became divine, but over generations, as power expanded, as systems grew more complex, as the need for stability became more urgent. The line between human and something more began to blur, and it is here, in this space between necessity and belief, between survival and meaning, that the foundation of the pharaoh truly begins to take shape. Because soon a leader would rise who would bring these lands together, not just through power, but through a new idea of what a ruler could be. And with that, everything would change. There are moments in history that are not marked by a single sound or a single event, but by a quiet shift that changes everything that follows. The unification of Egypt was one of those moments. For generations, the lands along the Nile had grown, expanded, and slowly taken on identities of their own. In the south, what would later be called Upper Egypt, the river ran narrow, contained between desert cliffs, its course steady, its communities closely tied to its rhythm. In the north, Lower Egypt opened outward into a wide and fertile delta where the river divided, spreading into multiple channels before meeting the sea. These were not just geographic differences. They shaped how people lived, how they farmed, how they organized themselves, and how they understood the world around them. Each region developed its own symbols. Upper Egypt, associated with the white crown, tall and narrow, a reflection of the land it represented. Lower Egypt, associated with the red crown, broad and curved, mirroring the spreading delta. These crowns were more than decoration. They were identity. They represented authority, belonging, and the right to rule. For a long time, these two lands existed in a state of tension, connected, yet separate, trading goods, sharing ideas, but also competing for control, for influence, for dominance along the river that sustained them both. And as leadership expanded, as regional rulers grew more powerful, the possibility of unification began to emerge, not as an abstract idea, but as a solution, because divided authority meant divided control over the Nile. It meant inconsistent coordination, conflict over resources, and a fragile balance that could easily break. At some point, a decision was made, whether through a series of conflicts or a gradual consolidation of power, a single ruler would rise above the rest. That ruler is remembered now as Nama, though time has softened the details and history has layered myth over fact. His legacy remains clear. He was the one who brought the two lands together. One of the earliest surviving records of this moment is not a written account, but an object, a carved stone artifact, known today as the Nama palette. On its surface, scenes are etched in careful detail. Figures stand in profile. Symbols are arranged with intention. And at the center, a king is shown in two forms. On one side, he wears the white crown of Upper Egypt, raising a weapon in a gesture of dominance. On the other, he wears the red crown of Lower Egypt, walking in procession, his authority fully established. This is not just art, it is a statement, a declaration that one ruler now holds both identities, that the division between lands has been resolved, that power has been unified. From this moment forward, the image of the ruler changes, no longer tied to a single region, but representing the entire land. And with that, a new symbol emerges, the double crown, a fusion of red and white, two forms brought into one. But the significance of this goes beyond politics, because unification did more than combine territories. It created something entirely new, a single system of authority, stretching from the southern cliffs to the northern delta, a single structure capable of organizing labor on a scale never seen before, a single figure responsible not just for a region, but for the balance of an entire civilization. And this is where power begins to transform, because when authority extends across distance, when decisions affect thousands, when coordination becomes essential for survival, leadership must become something more stable, more visible, more enduring. The ruler could no longer be just a person. They had to become an institution, a constant in a world that could otherwise shift without warning. And so, symbols became essential. The crown, the posture, the imagery carved into stone. All of it reinforced a single idea, that the ruler was not temporary, not uncertain, but permanent, that they stood above division, above conflict, above the changing conditions of daily life. This is the beginning of something deeper. Because when a ruler represents not just authority, but unity itself, their role begins to take on a different meaning. They are no longer simply leading the people, they are holding the world together. From this point forward, the idea of the pharaoh begins to solidify, not fully formed, not yet divine in the way it would later become, but moving steadily in that direction. The ruler now stands at the center of everything, between north and south, between land and river, between order and disorder. And as time continues, this role will expand even further, because maintaining unity is not a single act. It is an ongoing responsibility, one that requires structure, systems, and the ability to shape the land itself. And so, the next phase begins, a period where power is not only held, but expressed in stone, in architecture, in the transformation of the landscape, because soon the ruler will begin to build, not just for the present, but for something that extends far beyond a single lifetime. And in that act, the pharaoh will take another step from ruler to something far more enduring. Power, once established, must be maintained. And for something as vast as a unified Egypt, maintenance required more than presence. It required visibility. A ruler could not stand in every field or walk every stretch of the river, or speak directly to every community now bound under a single crown. Distance made that impossible. And yet, the idea of the ruler needed to be felt everywhere. So a new solution began to take shape, not through words, but through structure. Stone, unlike wood, which bends and decays, unlike mud brick, which softens and returns to the earth. Stone endures. It resists time, holds its form, and remains. Long after the hands that shaped it are gone, to build in stone was not simply a practical decision. It was a statement. It said, "This will last. This authority is not temporary. This order is permanent." At first, burial practices were simple. Shallow graves, covered with sand, the body placed carefully within, accompanied by objects meant to support the journey beyond life. Food, tools, personal items, things that suggested life did not end, but continued in another form. Over time, these burials became more structured. Graves were lined, then covered, then marked, and eventually they began to rise above the ground. These early tombs, known now as mastabas, were rectangular structures, flat-roofed, with sloping sides, built from mud brick and designed to protect what lay beneath. But even these would not remain unchanged, because as the role of the ruler expanded, so too did the expectations of what their resting place should be. If the pharaoh was no longer simply a leader, but a figure tied to order itself, to the balance of the world, to something beyond the visible, then their death could not be treated as ordinary. It required something greater. And so, during the reign of a ruler named Djoser, a shift occurred. Djoser ruled during what is now called the Third Dynasty, a period where the foundations of Egyptian civilization had already been laid, but where the expression of power was still evolving. At his side was a figure whose influence would echo far beyond his own lifetime, a man known as Imhotep. Imhotep was not a king, but something new, an architect, a planner, a thinker, someone who could take the abstract idea of power and give it physical form. Together, they would create something that had never existed before. At a site now known as Saqqara, construction began on what would become the Step Pyramid. But it did not begin as a pyramid. It began as a mastaba. Then another layer was added on top, and then another, each one smaller than the last, stacked carefully, rising upward, forming a structure that seemed to reach toward the sky. This was not just an architectural innovation. It was symbolic, because for the first time, a tomb did not simply sit upon the earth. It ascended. The Step Pyramid stood as a bridge between the ground and something beyond it. It suggested movement, not downward into the soil, but upward toward the heavens. And in doing so, it reflected a growing belief that the pharaoh in death did not remain among the living, but transitioned into another realm. Around the pyramid, an entire complex was constructed. Courtyards, passageways, walls that enclosed the space, all carefully planned, all precisely arranged. This was no longer just a tomb. It was an environment, a controlled space designed to reflect order, to preserve ritual, to maintain continuity beyond death. And perhaps, most importantly, it required coordination on a scale never seen before. Stone had to be quarried, cut, transported. Labor had to be organized, workers fed, tools created, processes repeated over and over again. This was not the work of a small group. It was the effort of an entire system, and that system could only exist under centralized authority. The construction itself became proof that the pharaoh could command resources, organize people, and reshape the land according to vision. The monument did not just honor the ruler, it demonstrated their power in a way that could be seen, touched, and remembered. As time passed, this idea continued to evolve. The step pyramid was only the beginning. Future rulers would refine the form, smooth the sides, perfect the angles, transforming stepped structures into true pyramids, each one larger than the last, each one more precise, each one pushing the limits of what could be built. But beneath all of these changes, the purpose remained the same: to create something that could not be ignored, something that would endure beyond generations, something that would reinforce again and again that the pharaoh was not temporary, not fragile, not bound by the same limitations as those who served beneath them. And so, with each stone placed, with each structure raised, the identity of the pharaoh became clearer. No longer simply a ruler of people, but a figure whose presence shaped the land itself. A being whose authority extended beyond life into death, and beyond that, into memory. And as these monuments grew, as their scale increased, as their meaning deepened, the question would begin to shift. Not just, who is the pharaoh? But, what is the pharaoh? Because soon, the answer would move beyond leadership and into something far more profound. Power, when seen, can be followed, but power, when believed, becomes something else entirely. By the time the great monuments began to rise, by the time stone replaced earth, and rulers reshaped the land itself. The role of the pharaoh had already begun to change, no longer just a leader, not simply a king, but something that stood between worlds, because the more authority expanded, the more responsibility it carried, and the greater the responsibility, the more difficult it became to explain it in ordinary terms. How could one person be responsible for the flow of a river, the success of harvests, the stability of an entire civilization? At first, these connections were subtle. If the Nile rose as expected, if crops grew, if life continued without disruption, then the ruler was seen as effective. But when something went wrong, when the flood failed or came too strong, when food became scarce or disorder spread, the question was no longer practical. It became existential. What had been disrupted? And who was responsible? Over time, a belief began to take shape, not sudden, not declared in a single moment, but forming slowly as patterns repeated, as generations passed. The idea that the world itself existed in a state of balance, a delicate alignment between forces that could not always be seen, between chaos and order. This balance would later be known as Ma'at. Ma'at was not just a concept. It was everything. It was the rhythm of the Nile, the turning of seasons, the rising of the sun, and its return each day. It was truth, justice, stability, the invisible structure that allowed life to continue. And if Ma'at was maintained, the world remained as it should be. But if it faltered, if chaos began to take hold, then everything could unravel. Floods could fail, harvests could collapse, conflict could spread. So the question became, who ensures that Ma'at continues? The answer, increasingly, was the pharaoh, not because of force, but because of position. The pharaoh stood at the center of everything, between people and the gods, between the land and the sky, between what was seen and what was believed. And from this position, a new idea emerged, that the pharaoh was not simply chosen by the gods, but connected to them. In early belief, the pharaoh was associated with Horus, The falcon god, a symbol of the sky, of vision, of protection. To say the pharaoh was Horus was not metaphor, it was identity. The ruler did not represent the divine. They were, in some way, part of it. And this changed everything. Because if the pharaoh was divine, then their authority was not temporary. It was not dependent on opinion or agreement or circumstance. It was inherent. It existed because it had to, because without it, the balance of the world itself could not be maintained. This belief extended into every part of life. Rituals were performed, not simply as tradition, but as necessity. Offerings were made to sustain the gods. Temples were constructed as places where the connection between worlds could be maintained. Priests carried out daily practices, ensuring that nothing was neglected. And at the center of all of it was the pharaoh, not always physically present, but symbolically essential. Even when unseen, their role continued through ritual, through representation, through the structures that had been built in their name. This is why monuments mattered, not just as tombs, but as anchors, points where the physical and the spiritual could meet, places where the presence of the pharaoh could be felt even beyond life, because death did not end this connection. If anything, it strengthened it. In death, the pharaoh was no longer bound to the physical world, no longer limited by time or distance. They became something more enduring, associated now with Osiris, the god of the afterlife, a ruler not just of the living, but of what came after. And so the cycle continued. In life, the pharaoh was Horus. In death, they became Osiris, and the next ruler would take their place. This continuity, this unbroken line, reinforced the idea that the system itself was eternal, that while individuals changed, the role did not. The pharaoh was not just a person, it was a position, a presence, a constant. And this is why belief became so powerful, because once authority is seen as divine, it no longer needs to be questioned. It becomes part of the structure of reality itself. And for a time, this system held for generations the balance remained. Monuments rose, rituals continued, the Nile flowed, and the world, as it was understood, remained intact. But no system, no matter how deeply believed, is entirely immune to change, because belief, like everything else, exists within time, and eventually, even something as powerful as this would be tested. For most people, the pharaoh was never seen. There were no daily audiences, no direct conversations, no moment where an ordinary person would stand before the one who ruled them. And yet, the presence of the pharaoh was everywhere, not as a voice or a face, but as a structure. It could be felt in the rhythm of work, in the expectations of the seasons, in the quiet understanding of where one stood within a larger order, because Egyptian society was not random. It was arranged, layered carefully, each role connected to another, each responsibility part of a wider system that extended outward from a single point. At the top stood the pharaoh. Beneath them, those who helped maintain the system, officials, administrators, individuals who acted not as independent rulers, but as extensions of authority. They oversaw regions, managed resources, ensured that instructions were carried out across distances too great for any one person to travel regularly. And then there were the scribes, quiet figures, often overlooked, yet essential, because as Egypt grew, memory alone was no longer enough. Fields had to be measured, harvests recorded, labor tracked, goods distributed. Scribes made this possible, using ink and reed pens. They marked surfaces with symbols that preserved information beyond a single moment. They turned speech into record, decision into permanence, and in doing so, they extended the reach of the system itself. To be a scribe was to hold knowledge, and knowledge within a structured world was power of a different kind. Beyond them stood the priests, guardians of ritual, caretakers of temples, mediators between the visible world and what lay beyond it. Their role was not separate from the pharaoh, but connected, because if the pharaoh maintained Ma'at, then priests ensured that the rituals supporting that balance were never neglected. Each day, in temples across the land, offerings were made, food, incense, spoken words, not as symbolic gestures, but as necessary acts to sustain the gods, to maintain the connection, to prevent imbalance, and below them, the majority of the population, farmers, laborers, craftsmen, people whose lives were shaped not by abstract ideas, but by daily necessity. They worked the land, planted crops, harvested grain. They built structures, shaped tools, created the objects that supported life. Their connection to the Pharaoh was not personal, it was systemic. They did not follow a ruler they knew, but participated in a structure they depended on, because the Nile continued to define everything. Its cycles determined when work began, when it paused, when effort shifted from fields to construction, to preparation for the next season. During the flood, when fields were submerged, many were called to labor elsewhere. It was in these moments that large-scale building became possible. Workers gathered, organized into groups, assigned roles. Stone was moved, structures rose, not through force alone, but through coordination, because survival depended on the system functioning. Food had to be stored, resources distributed, labor balanced across needs. And while later interpretations sometimes imagine constant oppression, the reality was more complex. This was not a society driven only by coercion, but one shaped by interdependence. People worked because the system sustained them, and in return, the system required participation. Taxes were not always paid in currency, but in goods, in grain, in labor. A portion of what was produced returned to the state, and from there it was redistributed, stored in granaries, used in times of shortage, allocated to workers, to temples, to construction efforts. This flow kept the system stable, because in a world where survival depended on cycles beyond human control, structure provided security. And at the center of that structure was the Pharaoh, not seen, but assumed, not present, but constant, a figure whose existence was less about visibility and more about continuity, because as long as the system held, as long as the Nile rose, as long as life continued, there was no reason to question it. And so For generations, this arrangement endured. Work continued. Rituals were maintained. Records were kept. And life, within its structure, moved forward. But beneath even the most stable systems, there are moments of strain, subtle at first, difficult to see, until they begin to accumulate. Because no structure, no matter how carefully arranged, is entirely immune to change. And when the balance shifts, even slightly, the effects can begin to spread slowly, quietly, until the system itself is forced to respond. For a long time, the system held. The river rose, the land responded, and life continued within the structure that had been carefully built. Fields were planted, harvests gathered, records kept, rituals performed, and above it all, the idea of the pharaoh remained intact, unquestioned, unchallenged, woven into the very fabric of existence. But stability, even when it feels constant, is never guaranteed, because the system depended on something beyond itself. The Nile, everything, from the smallest village to the largest monument, was tied to its rhythm. And for generations, that rhythm had been steady enough, predictable enough, to support the illusion of permanence. But there came a time when that rhythm began to change, not all at once, not in a single year, but gradually. Flood levels shifted. Some seasons, the waters did not rise as high as expected. The soil, less saturated, less prepared. Crops grew thinner. Harvests became uncertain. Other times, the flood came too strong, spreading beyond what could be managed, washing away boundaries, damaging what had been carefully maintained. These were not catastrophic events, not at first, but they introduced something unfamiliar: variation, and variation in a system built on expectation creates tension, because when outcomes no longer match belief, questions begin to form. At first, they are quiet. A failed harvest is explained as temporary, a stronger flood as an anomaly. But when patterns begin to repeat, when uncertainty lingers, the explanations begin to weaken. Because if the pharaoh maintains order, if they are responsible for balance, if their role is to ensure that the world continues as it should, then why is the system no longer responding? These questions were not always spoken, but they were felt in the hesitation before planting, in the careful rationing of grain, in the quiet awareness that something was no longer as stable as it once had been. At the same time, another shift was taking place. As Egypt had grown, so had its complexity. Regions were no longer small or easily managed. Authority, once centralized, began to stretch thin. Local officials, who had once acted as extensions of the pharaoh, began to hold more influence within their own territories. They controlled resources, managed labor, oversaw distribution, and over time, their roles began to change. Because distance creates independence, and independence can become power. These regional figures, known later as nomarchs, were still part of the system, but they were no longer entirely dependent on it. They governed locally, made decisions within their regions, and responded to conditions as they arose. At first, this strengthened the system. It allowed for flexibility, for faster responses, for localized control in a land that had become vast. But over time, it also introduced fragmentation, because when authority exists in multiple places, alignment becomes more difficult. Decisions differ, priorities shift, resources are managed unevenly, and slowly, the sense of a single, unified structure begins to loosen. This was not rebellion, not open conflict, but a gradual change in how power was experienced. The pharaoh still existed, still represented order, still held symbolic authority, but their influence was no longer absolute in practice. And as this shift continued, another layer of strain emerged. Monumental building, which had once demonstrated strength, required immense resources: stone, labor, food, time. All of it had to be sustained. But when harvests became uncertain, when regional control increased, when resources were no longer as easily directed, the cost of maintaining these projects grew heavier, and the return less immediate. Because a monument does not feed a population. It does not respond to failed floods or replace lost harvests. It exists as a symbol, and symbols, while powerful, cannot always sustain a system under strain. So, priorities began to shift, quietly at first, fewer resources directed toward large-scale construction, more attention given to local stability. And with that, the visible expression of centralized power began to fade, not disappear, but soften. And as it did, so too did the certainty that had once surrounded it. Because belief is strongest when reinforced, when monuments rise, when rituals are uninterrupted, when the world behaves as expected. The system feels complete. But when those reinforcements weaken, when structures are no longer built, when outcomes become uncertain, belief begins to change, not vanish, but shift. It becomes quieter, more personal, less absolute. And in that space, new interpretations begin to form. Perhaps the pharaoh is still essential, but not in the same way. Perhaps the system still exists, but no longer with the same certainty. This period would later be understood as a time of transition, not a sudden collapse, but a gradual movement away from centralized control towards something more distributed. A time when regions became more self-reliant, when local leaders gained prominence, when the balance between unity and independence began to change. What had once been a single, continuous structure became something more fragmented. And yet, life continued. Fields were still planted. Communities still adapted. People still found ways to navigate uncertainty. Because even as systems shift, the rhythm of daily life remains. But the question that had once gone unasked now lingered. What happens when the figure at the center can no longer hold everything together? And if the balance, once believed to be maintained by a single presence, can begin to falter, then where does order truly come from? These questions would not be answered immediately. They would unfold slowly across generations as Egypt adapted, restructured, and eventually reimagined what power could be. Because this was not the end, but a turning point, a moment where certainty gave way to complexity, and from that complexity, something new would eventually emerge, a different form of rule, a different expression of authority, but one that would still carry traces of everything that came before. Periods of instability do not end a civilization. They reveal its limits and force it to change. By the time centralized authority had weakened, Egypt was no longer the same land it had been at the moment of unification. It was larger, more complex, more dependent on systems that extended beyond any single region. And that meant one thing: if unity was to return, it could not simply repeat what had existed before. It had to be rebuilt. During the period that followed, authority did not disappear. It shifted. Regional leaders, who had once operated within a broader system, now governed more independently. They controlled land, managed agricultural output, organized labor, and made decisions without constant direction from a central figure. This created variation. Some regions stabilized quickly, others struggled. Success was no longer uniform, and this difference made something visible: that power could exist outside a single ruler, but it also revealed something else. Without coordination, the system lost efficiency. Trade became inconsistent, resource distribution uneven, infrastructure more difficult to maintain. Because while local control allowed for flexibility, it lacked scale. And scale had been one of Egypt's greatest strengths. Large irrigation coordination, centralized storage, mass labor organization. These were not easily replaced. Over time, pressure began to build again, not from conflict alone, but from necessity, because the Nile still required coordination. Flood levels still had to be observed, land measured, planting timed across regions, and without alignment, the margin for error increased. This created conditions for consolidation to return, not as an immediate shift, but as a gradual process. Certain leaders began to extend influence beyond their regions through control of resources, through alliances, through the ability to stabilize not just their own territory, but neighboring ones. This is how power begins to re-centralize, not by declaration, but by effectiveness. One region proves more stable than another. One leader more capable of maintaining order, and slowly, others begin to align with that authority. Over time, this alignment becomes structure, and structure becomes rule. This period of reorganization is often associated with the rise of rulers from Thebes in Upper Egypt. Thebes, positioned along the Nile, with access to agricultural land and trade routes, became a center of renewed authority. Its rulers did not inherit a fully stable system. They built one by re-establishing coordination between regions, by restoring communication, by reintroducing centralized management where it had weakened. But this time, the structure was not identical to what had existed before, because experience had changed it. The idea of absolute, unquestioned central authority had been tested. And while the pharaoh would again become a dominant figure, the system now incorporated stronger regional administration. Officials were not removed. They were integrated. Local governance remained, but within a re-established national structure. This created a more layered system. Central authority set direction. Regional leaders executed it. Coordination improved. And with it, stability returned. This period of renewal is often referred to as the beginning of the Middle Kingdom, a time when Egypt reasserted control over its land, its resources, and its identity as a unified state. But the changes went beyond administration. Because the experience of instability had left an imprint, the role of the pharaoh, while still central, was now understood differently, not only as a divine figure, but as a provider of stability, a ruler whose effectiveness could be measured, not just in symbolism, but in outcomes. Flood management, food security, infrastructure maintenance. These became visible indicators of successful rule. And with that, a subtle shift occurred. The pharaoh was still connected to the divine, still associated with order, still essential to the continuation of the system. But there was now an added layer: expectation. The ruler must not only represent balance, but deliver it. This had implications for governance. State projects expanded, but with greater attention to function. Irrigation systems were maintained more deliberately. Storage capacity increased. Transportation along the Nile improved, because the lesson had been clear. Symbolism alone was not enough. The system required performance. At the same time, Egypt began to look outward more deliberately. Trade routes extended beyond the Nile. Expeditions were organized into surrounding regions. Nubia, to the south, became increasingly important. not only as a neighboring region, but as a source of resources, gold, stone, access routes. Control of these areas strengthened the state and reinforced central authority through economic stability. Military organization also became more structured, not necessarily for constant expansion, but for protection, because instability had shown that internal weakness could create vulnerability, so defense became part of the system, not separate from it, integrated into how authority was maintained. This combination of administrative structure, resource control, and military organization created a more resilient form of rule, not immune to change, but better able to respond to it. And once again, the pharaoh stood at the center, but now as part of a system that had been tested, adjusted, and rebuilt. This was not the same rise that had occurred at the beginning. It was a second formation, one shaped not only by ambition, but by experience, and as stability returned, as coordination improved, as confidence in the system was restored, the conditions were set for another period of expansion, one that would bring new rulers, new expressions of power, and new challenges that would once again test the balance. Because Egypt was not static, it moved through cycles of stability and strain, growth and adjustment, and each time it emerged, changed. After periods of strain and the slow rebuilding of order, Egypt did not simply return to what it had been. It expanded. What had once been a civilization focused along the Nile began to extend beyond it. Trade routes widened, influence stretched outward, and the structure that had been rebuilt was now strong enough to project power beyond its borders. This period would later be known as the New Kingdom, a time when the pharaoh was not only a ruler of land, but a figure whose authority reached into surrounding regions. Campaigns moved north, into the Levant, south into Nubia, not always for conquest alone, but for control of trade routes, control of resources, control of access, because by this point, Egypt understood something clearly. Stability within depended on influence beyond. And so, the role of the pharaoh expanded once again, no longer just a maintainer of internal order, but a commander of movement, of expansion, of presence beyond the familiar boundaries of the Nile. This shift brought with it a new kind of ruler, one who did not only build or govern, but acted, led armies, directed campaigns, shaped the reach of the state in ways that earlier rulers had not needed to. And among these figures, certain names would endure, not only within Egypt, but far beyond it. One such ruler was Hatshepsut. Her rise was not expected. In a system traditionally defined by male succession, her position required something different. She did not simply inherit power, she established it through structure, through stability, through careful presentation. She adopted the full identity of the pharaoh, not partially, but completely, depicted in traditional form, wearing the regalia of kingship, integrating herself fully into the existing system. But her rule was not defined by war. It was defined by expansion of a different kind. Trade, expeditions were sent to distant lands, most notably to a region known as Punt. These journeys brought back goods that reinforced wealth and stability. Incense, wood, exotic materials, and perhaps more importantly, they reinforced the idea that Egypt was connected to a wider world, that its reach extended beyond what could be seen from the river. Her monuments, particularly at Deir el-Bahri, reflect this balance: structured, precise, integrated into the landscape itself, a continuation of the idea that power is expressed through control of space. But not all rulers of this period chose the same path. Where Hatshepsut emphasized stability and expansion through trade, others emphasized force. Thutmose III, often described as one of Egypt's most effective military leaders, expanded the state through repeated campaigns. He did not simply secure borders, he pushed them. Victory at battles such as Megiddo allowed Egypt to establish influence across regions that had previously existed outside its control. This was not random expansion. It was strategic, because controlling these territories meant controlling movement, goods, people, information. All could be directed. And through that control, Egypt strengthened itself internally. This pattern of outward movement reinforcing inward stability became a defining feature of the period. But power, even at its height, is not uniform, because alongside expansion, there are moments of disruption. One of the most significant came during the reign of a ruler known as Akhenaten. His approach did not focus on land or military strength, but belief for generations. Egypt had operated within a system of many gods, each connected to different aspects of life. But Akhenaten introduced something different, a shift toward a single central focus. The Aten, represented as the sun disk. This was not a small adjustment. It restructured the relationship between the state, the gods, and the people. Temples were changed, practices altered, symbols redefined. The pharaoh now stood not among many divine connections, but at the center of a single one. This concentration of belief created instability. Because systems that evolve slowly are not always able to absorb rapid change. And when Akhenaten's rule ended, much of what he introduced was reversed, a return to familiar structures, to established traditions, to the balance that had defined Egypt for generations. And it is within this restoration that one of the most recognizable names emerges, Tutankhamun, often remembered, not for the length of his reign, nor for the scale of his power, but for what remained, his tomb, largely undisturbed for centuries, contained objects that revealed a level of detail, craftsmanship, and belief that had rarely been preserved so completely. Through it, the image of ancient Egypt was carried forward into the modern world. Gold, symbolism, ritual, not as fragments, but as a complete expression of how power and belief had once been intertwined. And yet, even this was only a reflection, because the system itself continued to evolve. And among those who followed, one name would come to represent the peak of royal power, Ramses II. His reign, long and deliberate, was marked by construction, by expansion, and by something equally important, projection. He built extensively, temples, statues, monuments carved into stone at a scale that demanded attention. Places like Abu Simbel, where massive figures of the pharaoh sit, facing outward, not hidden, but visible. This visibility mattered because power, when seen repeatedly, becomes reinforced. His campaigns, including the well-known Battle of Kadesh, were recorded in ways that emphasized control, strength, and stability. Even when outcomes were uncertain, the narrative remained consistent because, by this point, Egypt understood something deeply. Power is not only exercised, it is communicated through images, through inscriptions, through the repetition of identity. And Ramses mastered this. His presence extended beyond his lifetime, not only through what he built, but through how he presented it. And so, at this moment, Egypt stands at its height, territorially expanded, structurally organized, symbolically powerful, a civilization that has moved from scattered settlements to unified state to empire, from local leadership to divine kingship to global presence within its world. And at the center of it all, the pharaoh remains, but something quietly has begun to change, because even at the height of power, there are limits. Expansion requires maintenance. Structure requires resources. Belief requires reinforcement. And over time, the weight of sustaining all of this begins to grow, not suddenly, not visibly at first, but steadily, because no system, no matter how strong, exists outside of time. And what has risen will eventually be tested again. But for now, at this moment, the image is complete. The pharaoh at the center of a world that has been shaped layer by layer, generation by generation. A figure who began as a leader and became something far more enduring. And it is from this point that we can begin to understand not only how the pharaohs rose, but what their rise truly meant. If you step back far enough, past the monuments, past the names, past the long arc of rulers and time, what remains is not a single figure, not a single reign, or a single moment of power, but a pattern that begins with something very simple, a river rising and falling, a land responding to its rhythm, and people learning to live within that rhythm as best they could. From that beginning, everything else followed. The need to coordinate, to plan, to measure, to remember. The emergence of leadership. At first practical, then structured, then symbolic, and over time, something more. Because as the system grew, as its scale expanded, as its reach extended beyond what could be seen, the role at its center had to change. The leader became a ruler. The ruler became a figure of continuity, and eventually a figure of belief. The pharaoh, not as a single person, but as an idea that carried through generations. An idea that order could be maintained, that balance could be preserved, that the world could remain as it was meant to be. And for a time, that belief held. It shaped the land. Stone rose from the earth, layer by layer, structure by structure, not only as tombs, but as statements that something here was meant to last. And in many ways, it did, because long after the voices faded, long after the systems shifted, long after the rulers themselves became distant, the structures remained, not untouched, not unchanged, but present. The outlines of pyramids still visible against the horizon, the faces of statues worn by wind and time, the interiors of temples, quiet now, but still holding the shape of what once occurred within them. And in that stillness, something becomes clear, that what was built was never only about power, it was about continuity, a way of reaching beyond a single lifetime, of preserving identity, of placing something into the world that would remain even when the people who created it could not. This is why the pharaoh mattered, not only as a ruler, but as a focal point, a place where structure, belief, and meaning could converge. And yet, even that was not permanent, because time moved differently than intention. What is built to last still changes. Edges soften, surfaces erode, meanings shift. And what was once understood clearly becomes something to interpret, something to wonder about, something to rediscover, piece by piece. Today, the names remain: Norma, Djoser, Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, Ramses, but they no longer exist as they once did. not as rulers, not as living figures, but as impressions carried forward through fragments, through structures, through objects that have outlasted their original purpose. And in that transformation, something interesting happens. Power becomes history. Belief becomes curiosity. And what was once unquestioned becomes something we return to, not to follow, but to understand, to ask, how did this begin? How did a river, a pattern, a need for coordination become something so vast, so structured, so enduring? And what does that say about the way people shape the world around them? Because in many ways, the story of the Pharaohs is not only about Egypt, it is about a process, the way systems form, the way belief strengthens them, the way structure gives them shape, and the way, over time, they change slowly, almost imperceptibly, until what once felt permanent becomes something remembered, something studied, something quiet. And now, if you imagine the Nile again, not as a place of labor or structure or power, but as it moves, steady, unhurried, carrying water through the same path it has followed for thousands of years. The surface reflects the sky. The edges of the land remain still, and the movement continues, unconcerned with monuments, unaffected by names, flowing as it always has. And in that movement, there is no urgency, no need to build, no need to preserve, only a quiet continuation of something that does not require recognition to exist. So as the story settles and the structures fade into distance, let the details soften, let the names drift, and allow the rhythm beneath it all to remain slow, steady, unchanging, like the river moving forward without effort into stillness